Is it ever too late to fix a broken past? Join us as we navigate the difficult road to redemption and the price of seeking forgiveness in a world that never forgets. Subscribe today and watch these powerful stories of hope and change.
The day I got the diagnosis, I was alone in the car. That's the part no one asks about. They ask what the doctor said, what stage, what treatment plan. They don't ask about the 40 minutes I sat in the parking garage of the hospital, engine off, staring at the concrete pillar in front of me, unable to make myself drive home. Because going home meant telling him, and somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I hadn't let myself look at directly in years, I already knew how that conversation was going to go. I was 34. We had been married for 6 years. His name was, I'll call him my husband, because that's what he was, and because the name still sits wrong in my mouth even now. My husband was the kind of man who coached youth soccer on Saturdays and remembered the names of every waiter at every restaurant we'd ever been to. He held doors. He called his mother every Sunday. Everyone who met him said the same thing, "You're so lucky." I had believed them. For a long time, I genuinely believed them. The lump in my left breast had been there for maybe 3 weeks before I worked up the nerve to get it checked. I told myself it was nothing. Fibrocystic tissue, the internet said. Very common, don't panic. I didn't tell my husband, because I didn't want to worry him over nothing. And also, if I'm being honest with myself now in a way I couldn't be then, because I had learned, slowly over 6 years, to manage the volume of difficult things I brought into our home. That's not something you notice all at once. It happens the way water shapes stone, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day you realize you have spent 3 weeks sitting with a lump in your chest, alone, because you don't know how to tell your own husband that something might be wrong with your body. The diagnosis was stage 2. Treatable. The oncologist used words like good prognosis and highly responsive, and I nodded, and I took the pamphlets, and I walked to my car, and I sat there for 40 minutes, and then I drove home. He was in the kitchen when I got back, making his protein shake, the blender going, baseball on the small TV above the refrigerator. He didn't look up right away. I stood in the doorway and watched him, and I thought, this is the last ordinary moment. Whatever comes next, this is the last second of before. I waited for the blender to stop. I told him. He put the lid back on the blender. He looked at me, and then he said, very quietly, "How long have you known something was wrong?" 3 weeks. I didn't want to. 3 weeks. I didn't want to. 3 weeks. He set the blender down. "You didn't tell me for 3 weeks. I wanted to wait until I knew something for certain. Do you know how that makes me look?" he said. "My wife is walking around with cancer and I don't even know. What am I supposed to say to people?" I remember the refrigerator humming. I remember the baseball announcer's voice, thin and distant. I remember thinking, this is not the conversation I prepared for. I had prepared for fear. For him pulling me close, his heart going fast, saying we'll get through this. I had prepared for tears, maybe. I had prepared for tears, maybe. I had prepared for a lot of things. Not this. "I'm sorry," I said, because that was what I did. I apologized. The treatment started 6 weeks later. Chemo first, then surgery, then radiation. My oncologist, Dr. Okafor, was a small, precise woman with close-cropped hair and reading glasses. She pushed up her nose when she was thinking. She explained everything twice, made sure I understood, gave me her direct line. She was the clearest, most competent person in my life during that year, and I used to think about that sometimes. That a woman I had known for 4 months was the person I felt safest calling when I was scared. My husband came to the first infusion appointment. He sat in the chair beside me for about 40 minutes, and then he said he had a work call he couldn't move and he left. He came to 2 more after that, across 8 months of treatment. Both times he was on his phone for most of it. His mother, I'll call her my mother-in-law, called me the week after I started chemo. I had always found her difficult but manageable, the way you find a drafty room difficult but manageable. You learn where to sit. I made myself useful to her. I remembered her birthday, remembered that she took her coffee with oat milk now, remembered that she didn't like to be asked about her hip. On the phone she said she was sorry to hear about my diagnosis, and then she said, "I just want you to know that stress causes these things, and you have always been a high-strung girl. He's worried about you, but he has his own pressures." She said it kindly. That was the thing about her. She had a gift for making a knife sound like a hand on your shoulder. I said thank you for calling. I went to most of my infusions alone. I drove myself. I sat in the recliner chair and I watched the bag drip and I listened to the audiobooks my friend, I'll call her my best friend, Lena, sent me every 2 weeks without fail. Lena lived in Portland. She had kids, a full life, and she still somehow managed to text me every single morning during chemo, just a message. Sometimes just a voice note of her dog barking at a squirrel. I don't know if she knew how much it mattered. At home things were quieter in ways that had nothing to do with illness. My husband started working late, then later, then sometimes not coming home until after I was already in bed, the nausea from the morning still coating the back of my throat, the anti-nausea wristbands on both arms because Dr. Drit. Okafor said to try everything. He would come in and I would feel the mattress shift and I would keep my eyes closed, not because I was asleep, but because I didn't have the energy for whatever the conversation might become. There was a night, I was maybe 5 weeks into treatment. The fatigue had gotten serious, the kind where even lifting your arms feels like lifting through water. When I asked him if he could pick up my prescription on his way home, it was ready. The pharmacy was 4 minutes off his route. He said yes. He didn't pick it up. He came home at 9:30 and he had clearly had dinner somewhere, and when I asked about the prescription he looked at me with this expression I had learned to dread. Not angry exactly. More like inconvenienced. Like I was a problem in his schedule that kept rescheduling itself. I forgot, he said. I had a lot going on today. I needed it tonight. It's for the nausea. Can't you just not eat for a while? The nausea is worse when you eat. I looked at him. That's not, I started, and then I stopped because I was too tired to explain the pharmacology of chemotherapy-induced nausea to my husband, and because I already knew that explaining it would not change anything. I would explain it and he would listen with the expression of a man waiting for a presentation to end, and then he would say something that missed the point so completely it felt deliberate, and I would end up apologizing for bringing it up. I called the pharmacy myself. They stayed open an extra 15 minutes. There was a party in February. His firm's winter event held at a downtown hotel. He wanted me to go. I had finished my last infusion 6 weeks earlier and was technically in recovery. Though recovery from chemo is its own country. You think you're through the worst and then your body laughs at you. My hair was growing back, white blonde and soft as a baby bird. I had bought a dress. I wanted to try. His colleague was there. I'll call her his colleague. She was in her late 20s, very polished, with the kind of confidence that takes up space in a room. I noticed the way she touched his arm when she laughed at something. I noticed the way she angled toward her. I noticed that he introduced me once. Briefly, as my wife without my name, and then didn't come back to find me for 40 minutes. I stood by the bar, sparkling water in my hand, watching the room. On the way home in the car, I said, carefully, you seemed close with her. She's on my team, he said. I know. I just noticed. You noticed what exactly? The careful nothing in his voice. I knew that particular nothing. It meant, choose your next words very carefully. Nothing, I said. I'm tired. You're always tired, he said. And that was that. I found the messages in April. I wasn't looking. I want to be clear about that, because the narrative always seems to want to cast the woman who finds something as a woman who was searching, and I wasn't. His phone was on the kitchen counter and it lit up while I was standing right there, and the preview was enough. I stood there for a long moment. Then I read back through 4 months of messages. I don't need to describe them in detail. You can imagine the content. What I will say is this. The dates included the week I had my surgery, the week I came home with 2 drains and couldn't raise my arms above my shoulder, and he had been tender in a way that hadn't felt like him. And I had told myself maybe the illness was changing things. Maybe we were finding our way back to something. I had been grateful for his tenderness. That tenderness had a reason. It was guilt or performance. I'm still not sure which, and I don't think it matters anymore. I put the phone back exactly where it was. I went to the bathroom. I sat on the closed toilet lid for a while. Then I washed my face and I went back to the kitchen and I finished making dinner. I needed to think. I was not ready to blow up my life while still technically immunocompromised. I told Lena that night on the phone. She was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she said, "What do you need from me right now?" And that question, that specific question, not what are you going to do or I can't believe him. But just what do you need? I started crying and couldn't stop for about 10 minutes. What I needed was a plan. I spent 3 months building it. I know that sounds cold. It wasn't cold, it was survival. I had just spent 8 months moving through the machinery of cancer treatment largely alone. I had learned to be organized about pain. You document it, you track it, you make the appointment, you drive yourself. I opened a separate bank account. I made copies of every financial document in the house. I met with an attorney, a woman named Ms. Mir Voss, who had an office above a dry cleaner in my neighborhood and who turned out to be the most competent person I had encountered since Dr. Okafor. And I learned what I was entitled to. I continued to go to my oncology follow-up appointments. I continued to make dinner. I continued to attend the Sunday lunches at my in-laws' house. My mother-in-law said to me once during one of those lunches, while we were standing at the kitchen island slicing tomatoes, "You know, a lot of men struggle when their wives are sick. It puts pressure on them." She said it without looking at me. "You should think about how hard this has been for him." I kept slicing tomatoes. "I think about that," I said. "A lot." I told him on a Tuesday. Ordinary evening, nothing special. I had chosen a weeknight on purpose because I knew he would have work in the morning and the morning would impose its own structure and he would not be able to spiral into something I couldn't manage. I said I knew about the colleague. I said I had spoken with a lawyer. I said I would be moving out at the end of the month and that I hoped we could do this without a trial. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "After everything I did for you this year." I had expected anger. I had expected anger. I had expected denial, justification, a version of events I wouldn't recognize. I had not expected that specific sentence, and for a second it genuinely took my breath away. "Everything you did for me," I repeated. "I stood by you. Do you know how hard that was? You were sick, you were unavailable, you or I had cancer. I know you had cancer." He said it like I was the one being unreasonable. "I'm not saying it wasn't hard for you. I'm saying it wasn't hard for you too. I'm saying it was hard for me too. And instead of appreciating that I'm still here, you weren't here," I said. "That's the whole point." He said I was being ungrateful. He said I was emotionally unstable, probably because of the hormonal effects of treatment, and that I should talk to my doctor before making major decisions. He said I had isolated myself during the illness and pushed him away. And that's why things had happened the way they had. This is the thing about a certain kind of man. He will stand in the wreckage of a house he burned down and tell you in complete earnest that you shouldn't have built it out of wood. I didn't argue. I let him talk. When he was finished, I said goodnight and I went to bed. I moved into a furnished apartment at the end of the month. It was small on the 3rd floor, with a window over a side street and a radiator that knocked. Lena flew out for the first weekend. We ordered pizza and she brought a plant for the windowsill, and we didn't talk about him very much. We talked about what I was going to do next. There was a day, maybe 6 weeks after I moved out, when I went back to the hospital for a follow-up scan. I sat in the waiting room with the same worn magazines and the same soft light, and I thought about the version of myself who had sat in those chairs during treatment, exhausted, frightened, going home afterward to a house that felt increasingly like a place I was allowed to exist in as long as I didn't take up too much space. The scan was clear. Dr. Okafor shook my hand. She said, "This is what we hoped for." I cried a little in the car, but a different kind of crying than before. I had been in the apartment for almost a year when it happened. I was at the farmer's market, the one near my new neighborhood, on a Saturday morning. Persimmons, late November, the vendor arranging them in a wooden crate. I was trying to remember if I had a recipe for persimmon cake when I heard his voice. He was maybe 20 feet away, with her. His colleague. They were at the cheese stand, and he had his hand at the small of her back, and he was laughing at something in the easy, unguarded way I had not seen from him in years. Maybe ever. He turned and saw me. The laugh stopped. I watched the series of calculations move across his face. Whether to pretend he hadn't seen me, whether to act casual, whether to come over, I watched him decide. He came over. She stayed at the cheese stand, examining labels with sudden intense focus. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. There was a beat. "How are you feeling?" he said, and I understood the subtext of it, the hope that I might seem fragile, diminished, that the last year might have taken more than it gave. I thought about the scan, the clear scan. Dr. Tenning. Okafor's handshake, the drive home with the windows down even though it was cold because I needed to feel the air on my face. I feel good, I said. Really good, actually. He nodded. He looked briefly at the persimmons I was holding. Something moved across his face that I couldn't quite name. Not remorse exactly. More like a man looking at a door he had locked himself out of and trying to work out if he cared. I heard you settled the case, he said. The case? As if our marriage were a municipal dispute. We did, and you're. He gestured vaguely at the market, at me, at all of it. You seem good. I am, I said. And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. There was nothing left to say after that. He knew it and I knew it. He went back to the cheese stand. I put the persimmons in my bag. I walked home through the late November light, and I thought about how much energy I had spent, for how many years, trying to be small enough to be safe. Being careful about which problems I brought home. Managing the temperature of every room I walked into. Sitting in hospital parking garages, alone, working up the nerve to say something is wrong. The scar on my chest has faded to a thin pale line. Dr. Okafor says it will keep fading. Most people won't notice it. I notice it. I look at it sometimes when I'm getting dressed and I think about the woman who sat in that car for 40 minutes trying to figure out how to tell her husband she was sick. I don't feel sorry for her exactly. I understand her. I know what she was afraid of. But I am not her anymore. My follow-up appointment is in 3 months. I'll drive myself, like I always do. I'll sit in the waiting room with the worn magazines, and when Dr. Okafor comes in with the results, I'll be there to hear them, fully there, the way I haven't been for a long time. Not managing anyone else's reaction, not apologizing for the inconvenience of my own body, just there, waiting to hear what comes next. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since everything happened, not in a dramatic way. Just the quiet, practical way you think about it when you finally have enough distance to look back at a long stretch of your own life and see the shape of it clearly. The thing I keep coming back to is this. Nothing that happened was random. Not the way my husband responded the night I told him about the diagnosis. Not the way his mother stood at that kitchen island and told me I should think harder about his feelings. Not even the 4 months of messages I found on that phone. All of it followed a logic that had been there from the beginning, built slowly out of every time I apologized when I shouldn't have, every time I made myself smaller to keep the temperature of the room manageable. Every time I sat in a car alone trying to figure out how to deliver my own pain in a way that wouldn't inconvenience him. I don't say that to blame myself. I say it because understanding it is the only way I know how to make sure it doesn't happen again. What I learned, what the whole year taught me, through chemo and the quiet apartment and Ms. Voss's office above the dry cleaner and Dr. Okafor's steady, clear-eyed competence, is that intelligence without honesty is just cleverness in the service of fear. I had been very clever for a long time. I knew exactly how to read a room, how to preempt a conflict, how to deliver difficult information in the softest possible packaging. I thought that was wisdom. It wasn't. It wasn't severe survival strategy dressed up as maturity. Real intelligence, I think, is knowing when the situation you're managing so carefully is the situation you actually need to leave. The moral piece is harder to talk about because it requires admitting that I was not simply a victim of his choices. I was also a participant in a dynamic I helped sustain. Not because I deserved what happened, but because I kept choosing accommodation over honesty year after year, and those choices had consequences too. Every time I said nothing when I meant this is not okay, I taught him that nothing was the acceptable answer. People learn what we teach them by what we tolerate. That's not judgment, it's just true. And then there's the question of what it actually takes to rebuild. Lena flew out with a plant and didn't make me talk about him. Dr. Okafor shook my hand and said this is what we hoped for. Those two women held more of my life together during that year than I have ever properly said out loud. Resilience is almost never a solo achievement. It's almost always the result of a few specific people who showed up without being asked and stayed without needing to be thanked. When I saw my husband at the farmer's market, standing at that cheese stand with his hand at her back, what I felt was not triumph. It wasn't grief either. It was something quieter than both, a kind of recognition. His life had continued in the direction it was always going. So had mine. The difference was that mine had changed course and his hadn't. And you could see it in both of us if you knew where to look. I picked up the persimmons. I walked home. The scar on my chest is fading. I think that's how it's supposed to work. Not punishment from the outside, but consequence from within. You make your choices, you build the life those choices deserve, and eventually, not always quickly, not always cleanly, the shape of it becomes visible to everyone, including you.